Welcome to BRHP In Conversation. We have an amazing and knowledgeable expert joining us today to talk about what's been termed as the childcare crisis we're experiencing in the United States and how making investments in children benefit all of us. We're going to be placing everyone on mute, but again, feel free to turn your cameras on. Feel free to let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from today, what area of Baltimore, or perhaps you're out of state. And if you're affiliated with an organization, including our mobility program, please let us know that as well. So I'll give you just a minute to let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat. I'm Adria Crutchfield, the Executive Director of BRHP. I'm tuning in from downtown Baltimore today. Welcome, Ms. Redmond, good to see you. One of our Client Advisory Board members I see has joined us. I see we have a number of staff, and a former board member of ours is also on the line. So we all really appreciate you all making time to tune in. Give y'all just another 30 seconds here. Got folks representing Anne Arundel County, wonderful. Again, feel free to drop that information into the chat. The Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership is a nonprofit with the mission of expanding housing choice for families with low incomes. These families have historically been excluded from housing and opportunities in well-resourced neighborhoods. As the regional administrator of the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program, BRHP couples housing choice vouchers with housing counseling supports to service over 4,300 families, primarily families with children, in accessing and transitioning successfully to safe, healthy, and economically vibrant communities throughout the Baltimore region. If you aren't familiar with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, it's a federally funded program that serves about 2.2 million households nationwide. It helps to make housing in the private market more affordable to eligible families with low incomes, people with disabilities, and older adults by providing rental assistance that makes up the difference between the market rate rent and 30% of the renter's adjusted gross monthly income. So much of what we do at BRHP is founded on the belief that quality housing and the future success of children go hand in hand, and that's why we're excited to have this discussion this afternoon. We hope that you not only gain insight on the issues facing families with children in accessing affordable care and wellness supports, but also an understanding of how this issue impacts the larger community. We also hope to shed light on some policy interventions that can help address these challenges. We'll have a Q&A session toward the end of the discussion today where you can ask your questions, so please be thinking of those as we converse. And then you'll be able to either drop those into the chat or raise your hand, and we will call on you and unmute you at that time for you to ask your question directly. So now let me turn to our guest of honor. Dr. Edwards is an economist, public policy consultant, and writer. She has researched and written about labor markets, unemployment, childcare, women's wages, Social Security, retirement, and poverty alleviation. She's testified 3 times in front of Congress, advocating for federal childcare, the expansion of Social Security, and tax reform. She is currently a writer for the Bloomberg Opinion, but more people recognize her from TikTok, where she posts educational videos about economics and public policy. I had the opportunity to hear from Dr. Edwards at a Maryland Family Network event this past spring and felt that BRHP's stakeholders also needed to hear some of her dynamic perspectives. So with that, Dr. Edwards, if you could please greet our audience.
Howdy, y'all. Thank you so much for having me. I hope you ask lots and lots of questions because I am a PhD economist, but my kind of North Star in my profession is that we are far too inscrutable and far too complicated for our own good, and we make people feel like they can't understand the economic issues that are so vital in their lives. So I like to, meet people and talk to people and hopefully instill in them, an empowerment that, even something like economics is not out of reach, and that there are policies and problems that we understand and we don't have to have a PhD to know it.
Really appreciate that. So we believe here at BRHP, everyone has a story worth sharing, and I'd like to begin by asking you to tell us your journey towards pursuing a career in economics and speaking out about an economy that works for the masses that contribute to it.
So I I had no aspirations to be an economist, through high school or college. But I graduated in 2007, which meant that the 2008 recession and financial crisis, that just it hit a lot of my friends hard looking for jobs after school. And it obviously hit the US hard. And I was just lucky enough to get a job as basically, a half administrative assistant at a lefty econ think tank in DC. And I started my job the day after Labor Day in September 2008. If you don't remember, September 2008 has its own Wikipedia page of all the things that went wrong in the economy in like 3.5 weeks. And that was my first month on the job. And I was scared like everybody else about what was going on in the economy. And I spent 3 years at that think tank, the Economic Policy Institute, basically tracking the extent of damage in the labor market. And what I learned from that experience was how often people who wanted to help those in trouble were basically told they're not allowed to. Like you can't give people money. That's not allowed. That would hurt the economy. You don't understand because you're not an economist. Or you can't raise the minimum wage. That would hurt people who you're trying to help. You're not an economist. You wouldn't understand. And I used to joke with my friend that it was like Star Wars, not to like out myself as too much of a nerd, but it was kind of like Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars being like, these aren't the droids you're looking for. Like, you don't get to have a thought or an opinion on this because an economist is telling you we aren't allowed to help people. So I wanted to have a seat at the table. I wanted to sit right next to them and say, I have the same degree you have, and I don't think that we would send the American economy into a tailspin if we had childcare, or if we raised the minimum wage, or if everyone had affordable housing. And so that compelled me. I guess I just revealed that I'm a deeply competitive person. but but that's also true. But I wanted to be able to speak in their language about the issues that I cared about.
That makes perfect sense. You and I share that competitive spirit while also
Yeah, let's never play putt-putt.
while also really wanting to
the lower
help.
the stakes, the worse I get. Yeah.
So let's begin with framing this problem. You've written extensively about what you identify as the childcare crisis in the United States. Can you explain more about what you mean by that and provide some data points to ground our conversation?
Absolutely. Childcare in the US is currently provided via a private market. So, in order to have childcare, someone has to start a business in which it is profitable to sell care of children. Families have to, in order to get care, have to meet this market rate. So it's like anything else, except for instead of selling T-shirts or selling, hot dogs or beds, you're selling the care of children, and the market has to clear at whatever rate. This market has been kind of on decline and in failure for decades. So, one key data point: the price of childcare has risen faster over the past 30 years than medical care, housing, food, energy, and even prescription drugs. Another data point would be currently, according to Zillow, the average mortgage payment in the United States is less than the average childcare payment. So it is easier to buy a house, which I realize what group I'm talking to when I say this. It is more affordable to buy a house for many families than it is to buy childcare. The problem is that you can't make looking after children that profitable. So in order to actually make money off of it, you have to charge a fortune that most people can't afford. So that's the problem, is that in the US, we have decided to provide care via a private market. That market's in failure. It doesn't produce enough care, and it doesn't produce affordable care. The second thing to know is that because it's provided by a market, the only way it can change is if somehow the market evolves or somehow government intervenes. Well, we know for a fact the first thing isn't going to happen, because the way that markets typically fix themselves is they have some type of breakthrough, a breakthrough in supply chains, a breakthrough in technology, a breakthrough in management. Nothing is coming for childcare. Childcare today is the same as childcare was 2 millennia ago. Children need the eyes, ears, and attention of a capable adult. That's expensive. There's no other way to make it cheaper. And there's no other way to make it more efficient or AI is not going to do childcare. They're just not. So for that reason, right, we have to have a public solution coming for childcare. And the third thing to know, other than like it's a market failure, it's not going to right itself. The third thing to know is that the gains to intervening in childcare are truly incredible. Were the federal government or a state government to intervene in childcare, the win for families would be really incredible. For the first, it would make it easier for people to work because they don't have to pay so high a premium in order to work. So more people would work, particularly more women. Two, the money that they spend on childcare, they can spend on other things, which they tend to spend on kind of investments in their children and family or just basic utilities. And then three, those children now have a more equitable access to early childhood interventions and early childhood education. So you would get things like maybe higher test scores down the line, we think, but probably what we get most is like better catching of like developmental delays, right? Every kid is now part of an educational program. That doesn't mean they're all going to get like perfect scores on the SATs, but it does mean that you're a lot less likely to start kindergarten behind.
Thank you for that framing. We are a housing provider, and I see some parallels between the affordable housing crisis and childcare crisis, but I'm wondering what parallels you see and what differences you see.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, housing and childcare have a similar problem in that we rely on the market to provide it. And for people for whom the market doesn't work, the government basically comes in and a market subsidy, right? The voucher. There is a child care voucher too. So it's, if the market's too expensive, you can't afford it, we'll start with the voucher. And then for very few people who have very low income, the government just provides the good directly. So you could have public housing, or you could have something like a Head Start program, where for a very small percentage of people, we can just provide the government can provide the good directly. For another percentage of people, also small, we can help with the voucher. But for the most part, we just let the market produce as is. So the approach that the government takes to both of these is basically preserve the market and help at the margins. For housing, the problem is that they just don't help enough, right? And they don't have enough of a companion supply policy, right? Where the government should be, increasing the low income housing tax credit to get more, multifamily housing built. They should be having a lot more cleverness when it comes to things like mortgage financing so that you could have portable mortgages and people can move around. There is a lot that the government can do to basically juice the supply of housing so that, if they were more generous with vouchers in housing, you could actually see a solution. Childcare, there's no market solution because housing needs to come in a lot of different forms. You need to hit different price points, different structures, different parts of the city. That's something that a market can produce well. For childcare, you're basically talking about what type of early education a kid gets, and that should be more equitable, right? There shouldn't be a massive price dispersion. It would be, imagine, which we kind of have, which we can talk about, this massive price dispersion in kindergarten, right? You don't expect it. You want kids to have a similar kindergarten experience because it's a public education. So you would want something similar for childcare. So whereas the market for housing is large enough and functional enough that it can be, helped, the market for childcare is just, it's never going to be enough. And for that reason, the market for childcare really needs to be subsumed by public providers. So basically, every care provider gets reimbursed, and families are capped in how much they pay. So they're taking a similar approach, but the nature of the markets, one of them is much more functional than the other. And again, I do realize I'm talking to people who would probably be like, I don't know how functional you think the housing market is, but it is more functional than the childcare market because right now estimates are about 40% of people are priced out of childcare. You can't, 40% of people have a hard time finding, more than 40% of people have a hard time finding housing, but they do live somewhere. So it's a more severe problem. But I am sensitive to glossing over housing difficulty.
Absolutely. So I think you mentioned this, but I'd like for you to expound just a bit more in the framing. You referred to high quality childcare as a proven good investment. So there is tremendous upside to providing this. So what are some of those economic benefits in providing accessible childcare?
right now, if I were to take stock of every kindergarten in the US, okay, these kids are 5, and I were to calculate their school readiness, there would be a massive gap where you have, you know, up to a third to 40% of 5-year-olds are not prepared for kindergarten compared to their peers. And you could do similar kind of comparisons of things like nutrition, both nutrition inadequacy and early childhood obesity. And you start to see these massive gaps because the early childhood experience in the United States is dramatically unequal, to the point that even at 5 years old, when they show up for kindergarten, economic inequality in the US has already been imprinted on children. The biggest difference of having accessible, quality early childhood education is that we make that less true. Now, there's lots of ways that that happens because they get early numeracy and literacy so basically imagine like the center-based high quality care that a rich parent can afford for their kid, versus a kid who is like doing fine but isn't getting education at, say, a grandparent's house or a neighbor's house where they're safe and they're happy, but they are not getting the type of investment that, say, a wealthier kid is getting, that they're not going through a curriculum designed perfectly for 3-year-olds to help them understand numbers. That type of inequity is starting to become more apparent in public school. And so that's the type of inequity that a high quality early childhood system could address. Now, it's worth saying you don't have to use it, but it's not fair that we don't get to use it.
So maybe we can shift to the impact of this crisis. So the fact that we don't have what we need, what's the impact? So how has childcare kind of become inaccessible? In what ways is it inaccessible?
Yeah, so it's mainly a price problem. Good care is expensive. And so if you can't afford it, you substitute for lower quality care or no care. But good care is also an investment in children's education and development. And lower quality care or free care is not necessarily. Now, I say this with the understanding that, that could be the preference. Like you want the kid to spend time like with their grandparent. Like all of that is fine. I think the problem is that because we're selling high quality early childhood investment, people who want to buy it can't. And so when you make a commodity of the care of children, right, you are guaranteeing that access is unequal. And so that impact can be massive. I always tell people there's a reason to like childcare if like you're in it for the kids or if you like kind of hate children and their parents. Like either way, there is something in it for you because childcare enables parents to work and it's an investment in the basically the future workforce. So like even if you're like, Jesus, I hate children. I really don't like their moms. I think they get enough help already. The evidence is pretty clear that childcare is a hindrance for a lot of women to work. And because they can't find it or afford it, they just don't work. But the scale to that can be really accumulating because if you don't work for 5 years when you don't have kids, I mean, our labor market can be a really cruel place. It doesn't exactly say like, oh, you were out for 5 years? Well, why don't you come back with a job as much wages and dignity? I mean, that doesn't happen for a lot of people, and so they just stay out. So rather than stay out for 5 years and maybe lose 5 years of work, 5 years of income tax contributions of a worker, they'll be gone for forever. And you've lost 35 years of income tax contributions because you basically shoved a mom out of the workforce and made it harder for her to come back. So maybe you hate moms, but you should love tax collections. That tends to correlate, by the way. People who don't want to invest in moms tend to want to have more tax collections. So it's, if you just care about the bottom line, you would want more people working, and childcare is a very clear way to do that.
Absolutely. I am a woman without children, but absolutely know the impact that not having adequate childcare has on the workforce, even just here at BRHP, which is a predominantly female workforce. So a lot of that resonates with me personally. Is the childcare crisis equally impacting all families, and who has a choice?
No, it's a really localized paying for your child's first 5 years of life. And then it's not spread equally because you're going to have pretty incredible inequality of, say, who has a second earner in the household versus not, who has paid family leave when their kid is born versus not, and then who can find childcare in their neighborhood, and then who can afford the childcare that is in their neighborhood. So I think, it's very much comes down to resources, and there's a very high correlation that resources determine the quality of care. What researchers have found is that the education of the mom, very much predicts the quality of early childhood care for the child, no matter what venue they get it from. So if they go to a center-based care, if they go to a home-based care, if they have a nanny in the house, right, all three of those quality will vary with the mom's education, because that tends to be a good proxy for the income of the family. So I think that's all true. That kind of like casually operates off of the assumption that most people want to have their kid in some type of external care arrangement, that they want their kid either in a family-based, like a home-based care, or they want their kid in a center-based care. And there are people who would prefer to have their kids at home and would want to be home with them. Unfortunately, in the US, the federal government does not think that that's okay. And if you are not working and you are a mom and you don't have a partner, federal government just doesn't like you. I mean, I say that kind of out of pocket of the work requirements, the work incentives, the number of public programs that the federal government refuses to pursue because it could result in some moms not working, has led to, I think, a pretty clear value statement that the federal government thinks single mothers should be working. They ended welfare. They expanded the earned income tax credits. They put work requirements on food stamps. They're putting work requirements on Medicaid. And at this point, we have a mountain of evidence of just how amazing the child tax credit expansion was, for that brief period in 2021. And the number one reason why we don't have it is the concern that a mom may stop working. So it's a very kind of delicate conversation to have in terms of policy, because you don't want the expansion of access to care to seem as if it's piggybacking on, and I think all mothers should be required to work and no one should be allowed to stay home. I think that that's a whole other conversation that is important of why we make this value statement. And so I don't want to make it seem like I endorse kind of that policy history, or that childcare expansions are an endorsement of that policy history. I think it's its own kind of larger conversation. I will say, in terms of numbers, 2/3 of women with children under 6 are working, and every expansion of childcare that is affordable and high quality has resulted in more women working, which is why I kind of say casually more women would work, and that more women want to work than childcare allows. It's not a universal statement, but it is on average true.
Appreciate that context. We see this in the work that we do, that, historic discrimination by the federal government, and then there's the trickle down effect by state and local as well, has harmed mostly Black and brown households. Have you seen that similar effect in this childcare crisis? Who really doesn't have choice? I think maybe is a more pointed question to you.
Yeah, the people who don't have choice are the people who don't have money, and who have to find care. Right. So I think it's the difference between, say, a woman who is rich and whose husband works and who decides she wants to stay at home, versus the woman who has no choice, has to work, and cannot afford care. That childcare leaves behind, the childcare crisis affects the people who have the least amount of choice in the matter. Least amount of choice in that they have to work, and least amount of choice in that there's no childcare option for them that's tenable. That is overwhelmingly or disproportionately going to be Black and brown women. And it doesn't affect white women the same way that it affects kind of Black and brown women.
Right. Again, a parallel with what we see in our housing world. Maybe you could speak to how the lack of access to affordable and accessible childcare affects the children, the fathers, the families. perhaps how it impacts, who is entering different career paths. Could you give us any more color to who it's impacting?
Yeah, so it's a little, the economist language for speaking about this, believe it or not, can be a little clunky. Shocking, I know. The economist may lack subtlety, but let's start with a two-parent household. So if you are in a two-parent household and you have to do something like the dishes, you don't start the dishes, stop at the halfway mark, throw your hands up Top Chef style, and then say change, and then like other person comes in. Like when we think of families sharing household responsibilities, we don't think of them like dividing them 50-50. We think of them allocating, like you cook, I'll clean. Like he does garbage, I do laundry. And we think of them, this is the most kind of effective way to split up all the things that people have to do in a household, is to basically kind of like assign task and not divide task 50-50. You don't do the dishes like that. No one does. It's crazy. And also certainly not in my house, because my husband is not as good at the dishes as I am. So that also comes down to the care part. Who finds care? Who does pickup? Who does drop off? Who is the parent of first resort if care falls through? That is a parent. That and it makes perfect sense in a household that it would be one person who's kind of on the hook for the childcare part. Because women are historically paid less than men, right? The best financial decisions that a lot of households can make is to have the mom take care of all the care work. And that means pull back. If she has a career, pull back from it. If she could, say, take a consultant job that pays twice as much but has her on the road 4 days a week, she's not going to do that because someone has to be the care facing parent. And that's not, I mean, sure, it reflects a lot of like misogyny and like historical discrimination against women, but it also is just kind of an effective choice for families to make because they have to do something. That's how we know care affects a two-parent household and the career of women, is that it basically forces a pullback from the labor force by necessity from one parent, and that tends to be the mom. So in a one-parent household, right, everything is different because you are both parents. You are the mom, you are the dad, you're the primary earner, you're the primary caregiver, and you have to do everything on your own. And so the lack of care and access to care and affordability care just squeezes you in every direction. And economists don't have a great way of explaining kind of to the same degree that we can explain what I just described, which is intra-household bargaining. It's a household of one, right? So you are the household, but it limits their ability to make choices. So that was a bit of a ramble, but there was a really excellent study in, I think, Germany, where they looked at women's commute to work. And they found that women routinely turned down higher paying jobs if it changed their commute to work because they had to make pickup and drop off. That type of like economic truism happens probably to every mom in the US, where that you cannot, if you have a partner or if you don't have a partner, you don't get to be 100% in your career. You have to make choices that enable you to care for your kid. And if childcare is terrible, right? If it closed all the time, if it's not reliable, if they sometimes don't have enough staff to meet ratio requirements and close, if you can't afford it, right? That all of those would affect you in numerous ways. Not just, I mean, if just the actual commute can have you turn down a higher paying job, I mean, imagine if it wasn't there 2 days a week. And so those types of studies give us a lot of intuition for just how almost immeasurable lack of access to care can affect women as workers. And that's ignoring like children. That's just like the mom as a worker, not even the mom as a person, not even the mom as like someone who has her own well-being and health and stress, maybe wants to exercise, and totally ignoring the effect on the kids. That's just the relationship to work.
So we talked a lot about the framing. We have talked about the impact. Perhaps now we could shift to effective interventions. Is there an aspect of early childhood wellness that is most important in your mind to invest in based on the data that you've seen, particularly for families with incomes below 50% AMI?
Yeah, no one should have to go into debt or borrowing to have care for their children. And no one should be made to feel guilty for wanting to seek care for their children. I think those are two kind of those are the two basic like stigmas that kind of stick around from the market-based childcare that we have. That there's this, why aren't you staying home with your kids and you're buying care instead stigma, and then like why aren't you earning more money and getting better care stigma. So I think what the data has shown is that when care is good, it is very good for children. And if you have good, and by that I mean high quality, well staffed, well ratioed, you can really affect children's outcomes, not just in kindergarten, but through high school, because you're giving them the tools for early education and for early nutrition. And those effects would be so large, we don't really even know how to quantify them.
Tremendous, tremendous upside, as you said at the beginning of our conversation. Are you aware of any interventions that perhaps have been implemented on a smaller scale within maybe just a locality that have shown to ease the strain of an inaccessible childcare? And then maybe we could also shift back to the child tax credit, which is a much larger scale intervention, and your thoughts on what's preventing embrace of those solutions.
The yeah, the state of New Mexico has just voted to put into their constitution a permanent funding mechanism and the right to childcare. So they will be the first state in the country to have universal access to childcare. And they made it. They have some land trusts, and then they're appropriating funds dedicated to early childhood education. So like they put into their constitution not only that you get it, but that they fund it, and they are expanding early childhood care. The first thing that happened when they did that is what I think everyone who works in childcare could have told you was going to happen. They immediately had way too many people trying to get care. Like we call this the oversubscription problem, that as soon as you offer free care, you're probably going to have a mom that's like, I'd like to stay home. I think this is a special time. And they're like, oh, it's free. Yeah. Here you go. Take them. If I don't have to pay like $24,000 a year and I can go do something else, you should take my kid and put them in care. So that was problem one, but they are in the process of rolling it out. It's going to take a few years. Places that have come closer are the District of Columbia. DC has universal access to pre-3 and pre-4 in its public school system. I think they offer both a model and cautionary tale. Their pre-3 and pre-4 education, they put a lot of money into. It's very high quality. The teachers make what kindergarten teachers make. They have specialized training and education, so it's not like take some 11th grade teacher, just put them in pre-3. These are dedicated. It took a lot of money to get the training of the staff right. However, it has really upended the 0 to 3 private market. DC has the most expensive childcare in the country because they only serve 0 to 3. And the city has also had to put a lot of resources towards trying to stabilize this like very fragile 0 to 3 market. So you have to do it well, get the staff to be dedicated to what they're going to do, and that takes time and money. But the market without 4 to 5-year-olds who are very cheap compared to an infant, the market becomes unstabilized. And so they have like some of the longest wait lists in the country, the most expensive care in the country. Even for an infant, it's the most expensive care. So probably the model that I think the US would most gravitate towards is Canada's, which is a capped cost system. Parents pay a capped fee where it's like you pay they called it the $10 a day campaign. Every parent pays $10 a day. And then the government basically covers the rest of cost. So if you're a child care provider, all of your parents are giving you $10 a day, and then everything else you're basically being reimbursed by the government. The real advantages to this program is that what we've learned from expansions of care in almost every setting is that families really value choice. Like maybe they want a center. Maybe their 3-year-old needs to be in a chair because they are bored and misbehaving. Maybe their 3-year-old needs to be in more of a center or a family-based setting. Families like having choices over where their young kid is. And so a reimbursement model basically allows people to kind of dictate the care available based on what they want, and the government just kind of fills in the cost. And so a lot of the choices still come from families. And then of course, all the licensing is still local. So you've got like federal money That's the best kind of money. And then you have state and local decision making on quality. That is best for families. And then you've got the provision where it's very diverse in terms of what you can get. And that is what Canada is currently transitioning to. And so I think that's probably the model that makes the most sense for the US. I will say, I think New Mexico is moving towards that model as well, but they are putting a lot of money towards it that other states don't necessarily have.
Here at BRHP, we've piloted a program called the Activities for Child Enrichment. It's a stipend, a cash stipend to some families who have qualifying aged children in our mobility program to promote social connections across socioeconomic class. Their parents are basically using that money to spend on extracurriculars or mentoring programs for their kids, a tutor for their kid. And I was wondering if you could share maybe your thoughts on what the data say about the overall benefits of something like a direct cash assistance to families or whatever the need might be. And in this case, it could be childcare or something else.
Yeah, it's funny. I would say it's a mountain of evidence that I wish we had in 1996. Not that welfare, that AFDC was perfect, especially if there are some like veterans on the call who are like, let me tell you, Sonny, let me tell you, little child, about what AFDC was like. But, if you give cash to low-income parents, they spend it on utilities, rent, and food. That's where the vast majority of money goes. And if they have something extra, they spend it on their kids. And it doesn't have to be something that's immediately justifiable. Like maybe they took their kids to the aquarium and the fees are expensive. But, I think there was a lot of myth making around poor people that was very much, based on personal attacks, on low key racism, on high key racism. And the evidence is very much in coherence and in deep contrast to basically what Americans were told poor people were like when they were making these decisions. So we've looked at, there's a spate of around 90 universal basic income demonstrations. So this is a study where people are randomly assigned, some with kids, some without, who are low income in a locality. And a foundation is basically paying for them to get cash for a period of time and then asking them what they do with it. They never give it to rich people. Like this foundation is not like, oh, well, let's give $200 to someone who makes $100,000 a year. They're not doing that. These, even though it's universal basic income, all of the demonstrations are amongst very low income people. So the first one was in Stockton, California. That was a big one. Then we also have the evidence from the child tax credit, in which every family, regardless of how much income they had, got cash for 6 months to help if they had children. And then in addition to that, we have small scale studies that are kind of academic driven. They're not universal basic income. One's called Baby's First Year, in which women were randomized like in a hospital. Right after they delivered, the researchers came and be like, do you want to get money each month? And then let you ask us questions. And they're like, sure, sounds great. And they got randomized into 2 levels. One of them got like 100, one of them got like 500 or 400. And all of these studies show very consistent evidence, which I'm sure none of you need to be convinced of, that life is expensive. And if you have money, you spend it on maintaining your life for your kid. You make sure the heat is on in the winter, the AC is on in the summer, that they have, shelter over their heads, that they never miss meals. And then you get to do things like, the Baby's First Year study gave all the participants a camera and told them to take pictures of what they bought with the money from their cash card. I mean, who would be surprised to learn that it's a lot of Christmas trees and diapers and like a new toddler bed. So she doesn't sleep in her mom's bed anymore. She gets her own big girl bed. But you can't, even though that's intangible, maybe for people to say like, oh, if you got a toddler bed at 4, you're better off than someone who didn't. Like, it doesn't have the type of long-term outcomes we want. It's just those intangibles that make life better for children. So it really raises the question why we seem to be so reluctant to do it.
Totally appreciate that. And I think you just pointed to some commonalities that we all have, regardless of kind of our backgrounds and income. You know, lots of us would want to give gifts to our children or make sure they have like a quality birthday experience or perhaps a quality Christmas in terms of what you just illustrated. So I really appreciate that. I have so much enjoyed speaking with you. We're gonna open it up to our audience members now. So folks who have joined us, if you have a question you'd like to ask, you can raise your hand using the little emoji on Zoom, or you can drop your question into the chat and we will happily either read it out loud or call on you to ask it. So please don't be shy. Now's your chance to ask Dr. Edwards some of your own questions that maybe I didn't actually touch on this afternoon just yet. So.
Okay, I see it in the chat. Is there a benefit to incentivizing or encouraging large private companies to offer childcare, or is privatization of the industry expanding? Should we just have employers offer childcare? Like, rather than go through just like this, kind of complicated public system, what if we just expanded it from employers? If you expanded it from employers, people who are poor or don't have a college degree would probably never get it. The way that they don't get health care, the way that they don't get retirement, the way that they don't get paid sick days. It is about, so I will say, even a sick day, a quarter of private sector workers don't have one. They don't have paid sick. So the idea that you would have massive expansions into childcare, which is much more expensive than a sick day, it would never reach. I mean, I would assume it would never reach like the bottom 80%. Paid family leave is currently about the top quarter of workers, and I bet that's where childcare would end up. So I don't think it's the solution. What I do think is that even if you had this like capped cost system and we did a full Canada model, like full New Mexico model, there are certain employers who have very specialized childcare needs because of the timing of their work, right? Like you have hospitals that work 7 to 7 and childcare that's open 9 to 5. So you could imagine that one of the institutions that enter the provider space to be reimbursed are on sites, not necessarily run by a company as a benefit for their employee, but kind of hosted by a company, still reimbursed by the government, but like to meet a special workforce need. So there are 24-hour daycares in the United States. Toyota has 2 of them. One of them they've had since the middle 90s, and it's for people who work the overnight shift. Like they pick up their kids from school, they have dinner, and when it's time to go to bed, they like drive the kid with their pajamas to the 24-hour daycare where the kids spend the night, and then they pick them up on the way out of their shift. And that is a daycare that meets a very specialized workforce need. They do it out of pocket and they say it's worth every penny, but not everyone can do that. But I think in a world in which childcare isn't operating off of scarcity and profit, but instead of kind of access and equity, those things would be more common, and it wouldn't have to be an employer benefit. It would be something that the government would do to like guarantee that workers are able to get a job. Okay, sorry, do you want to read the next one? I'm looking at the chat and I'm like, I'm ready.
No, sure. The next one is actually from a team member of ours. Your thoughts on the probability of the DC model expanding, if you think that actually is a feasible model. He's here in Maryland, so I think he's interested in potentially, a program, any type of program here in Maryland. What are your thoughts?
I think so I think there's 2 ways to think of this question. One is, is pre-3 and pre-4 going to expand? And the answer there, I think, is yes. It's expensive, but the benefits of preschool are really, like, I think the data is really starting to kind of just accrue of like, wow, that is a lot of good things that happen to help kids get ready for kindergarten. And so I think you're going to see an expansion of pre-3 and pre-4. And if you take the lowest cost kids from a revenue-based care system, you are going to have problems in the care system. So I think, DC kind of knew this was going to happen, but it showed just the extent of it. So I think the DC model will expand, but I hope it expands with the lesson that if you spend more money on 3 to 4, you have to spend more money on 0 to 3. DC started a pay equity fund to basically start subsidizing from the city the pay rates of its childcare workers. So if you make, $14 an hour at a childcare center in DC, you're going to get, an extra like 14 grand from the DC government just as an add-on to your pay. So now the DC government is cost sharing childcare. So I think if your question is the DC model going to expand within DC? Yes. It's working its way to basically starting to take over to 0 to 3 system. I think the DC model expanding to other localities, yes, the pre-3, pre-4 is going to expand, but I don't think DC has a good benchmark of what to do about 0 to 3. I will also say DC has a couple of problems that in certain states tend to work itself out, where if you have a big state, you have very rich people in certain urban areas, but then you have a lot more at the middle and bottom spread out. DC is so small. I think one of the things that's kind of keeping them from subsidizing fully 0 to 3, so there's a lot of very rich people using childcare. And so there are a lot of people who can afford childcare within DC. That is probably a larger share than if you zoomed out to a state, right? If you zoom out to a state, you don't, like, all of the rich people tend to be in very urban areas. That's what DC is meeting. And so probably half of the people who are buying childcare in DC, if forced, would be able to pay more because they're very high income earners. And then the other half are just completely priced out of the market. That's a very different challenge in a small place versus, something like, a state where if you have the entire state of Maryland, right, there are like the share of rich people of Maryland is smaller than the share of rich people in DC, if that makes sense. So for what it's worth, the other thing DC did is that now if you get the pay equity fund for your staff, you have to accept vouchers. And I think that was a pretty smart move.
Could you actually expound a little bit more on that voucher subsidy? I am aware that Maryland has a childcare voucher program. But who does that serve, and who is still kind of left out?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discretion in the state and who it serves, because the child development, I get it wrong every time. It's like DBGB, so Child Development Block Grant something. Yeah, I care about. I'm a child care policy expert. That's why I can't name the legislation. They have money specifically for helping people afford childcare who meet the low income specification, and the locality has determination over who that is. In DC, I think it just goes to the lowest income. DC has, I think DC does categorical eligibility with some of its other programs. So like if you get a housing voucher, you get a childcare voucher, you get food stamps. They just usher everyone in. DC is a pretty liberal place. There would be other localities like, say, I have a friend who is a researcher in Wyoming, and after like 4 hours of trying to apply for food stamps, he stopped. And you're right there. So they don't, like, you can imagine, like, it would be easy if you do categorical eligibility for vouchers versus not. And some places make it easy, and some places hard. Some places you have to be working, some places they don't care. So it varies a ton, but it's basically like the government tells you are going to pay 7% of your income for childcare, and we are going to cover the rest. And here's the ticket that you give to the childcare that the government will then give them.
Got it. Thanks for that. Another question in our chat: do you see government funding as a potential way to increase the availability of different types of childcare for historically underinvested communities, where I assume fewer options are available, and what other things, if any, need to be done? And that comes from one of our summer interns here at BRHP.
Yes, absolutely. So let's say the federal government decides tomorrow, or the state of Maryland decides tomorrow, we're going to have universal childcare in the US/Maryland. What they could do is set aside part of the funding that they dedicate to that to the expansion of centers. Right now, to be a viable business in a low-income community, you can't exactly offer an expensive good or service. right? If you take the expensive part out of the good or service, it really changes who is able to kind of become a child care provider. You just need to meet the licensing requirements. You don't have to make money off of it. And I think that that would radically change who decides to offer care and where. And then you would have basically a capital investment kind of fund that helps people convert either space into childcare or because one of the options that is very popular is to have a grant program specifically for making childcare centers in houses of worship. People have thoughts on it. It's it as because it's like that's too close to the vouchers that they want to do through K through 12. So even though it's a good idea for 0 to 5, I don't want to do it because it's like the next step is vouchers, but they are empty most days of the week. And so there's special grants that some people are trying to pursue of converting space at houses of worship into childcare that is not necessarily run by the house of worship, but uses the house of worship space. So there's lots of ways to leverage spaces inside communities, build them inside libraries. If there was a capital investment fund dedicated to converting or constructing space for care, the only thing stopping underinvestment in a low-income community is just someone there getting the money.
I think you saw a lot of that when New York City moved to pre-K for 4-year-olds and then 3-year-olds in terms of the providers, what spaces could be deemed eligible for that now that the government was going to fund it. And I'm actually thinking too of just for us in the housing world, it's not just about the affordability, it's also about the supply. And so we need the types of housing options as well. So
I think this is
parallel.
Yeah, and home-based care is really popular for this reason. That like if you just need a basement, right, then you can become a home-based provider. And I think that they are like a very flexible part of the child care providers that parents tend to really love. You could imagine someone who lives in like a row house in kind of a low income part of Baltimore that converts their basement into a childcare, and now they run a business, right? And it doesn't like they didn't have to, if you don't have to make money off of it, and you can just be reimbursed for what you do, right? It's a lot of it. I mean, something we haven't talked about at all so far is that there's the people who probably have the most economic opportunities to gain by this being handed out in a just way are the workers and people who run the businesses, who currently underpay themselves or are underpaid because the only people they can squeeze for more money are families who already can't afford it. But if you invested in care, we never say this part directly. When you invest in childcare, you're basically investing in workers making decent money. That is like 80% of the investment, because that is about 80% of the cost of childcare are the workers in the building, whatever that building is. So that they are poised, it creates good jobs and it creates basically leadership and business opportunities in every locality in the United States that largely women of color will do.
We're almost at time. Just maybe you could speak to part of the last question that I see here in the chat, which is just, you had mentioned that you think that the United States should follow Canada's model, but what do you think the likelihood of that might be? And would it be precisely that model, or do you envision some changes?
I think of all the models, Canada is probably the one that's like coheres most with like the US ethic. Like France has basically a public 0 to 5 system similar to like a public K through 12 system. I don't think the US would ever go there. I think having kind of a public private partnership, having kind of a real diversity of providers in which families still have to pay a certain share is much more American. Now, is it coming? This is where I will put on my economist hat and say, it doesn't matter how long children have needed it or need it. It doesn't matter how long this has kept mothers from like truly flourishing in the workforce. None of that matters. The US is in a 15-year fertility decline. It is historic. It started at the Great Recession, and everybody thought it was going to stop once the economy recovered, but it didn't. Fertility kept declining, and we are poised to see one of the smallest generations in US history. Low fertility is like the plague of large economies. Not because we're built on some kind of like Ponzi scheme population, but people not having children reflects a deep lack of trust in the economy. and a lack of financial, like basically hope in the economy. So the United States is in a 15-year decline of birth rates that they've never seen before. So at some point, we don't care about kids, we don't care about their moms, we do care about fertility, and childcare is the #1 cost families state when they say why they're not having another kid. They can't afford childcare for 2 children. So at some point, this is going to sound so bad, but at some point, all these old men in Congress are going to have to realize they can't have higher fertility until they pay for childcare. And in fact, almost every other industrialized country that has childcare was moved by birth rates. The US, like it's like Germany is not like, man, we love women and children. Germany was also terrified because of falling birth rates. And it's same thing in Italy. These countries were often very much motivated by fertility and not by like love of children and their moms. So I think childcare is coming for that reason. The second reason why I think childcare is coming is that the baby boomers have retired. United States labor force participation, the share of people who are 25 to 54 years old who are working is the highest it has ever been in US history, and we still don't have enough workers. There's nowhere else for them to come from unless we import them and have more immigrants, or we grow them and have more people not working work. The most expandable part of the non-working working age population is moms. So something is going to force Congress's hand. Either they need more workers or they need more children, and childcare sits at the center of both. So I am not optimistic that we're suddenly going to do the right thing for children and moms, but I am very optimistic that large economic forces are going to force Congress's hand, and within 10 years, we will be in the Canada system.
I'm so grateful that you became an economist. Really can't wait to see where we go from here in terms of that prediction. And sometimes the truth hurts. So I appreciate everything you just said. For us, do you have any call to action? Are there any small steps we can make? Any advocacy we should be doing? How can we lift up our own voices? How can we utilize our own agency in this effort?
Y'all do incredible work on the ground, working with people whose lives are affected in ways that they do and do not understand, are affected by these like big conversations and policy that happened 25 years ago. And the work that you do in helping people find housing and helping people basically find the security that comes from housing is amazing. And it's you probably don't get nearly enough recognition for the hard work that you do. You're at the edge of a market that doesn't want to provide for the people who need the good. And I'm just incredibly awed at the work that you do. So that's one. And I think my call to action would be that every time, you're able to buck just the layers of stereotypes and discrimination that low income Americans face, that is kind of one step on the way towards having better policy when people aren't afraid to help low income people anymore. And low income people are deeply otherized in the US. And everything that you do to help people find communities and find shelter is one kind of like just chipping away at that otherization. And so just keep doing that work and knowing that you accomplish more than you see.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Edwards. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us for this BRHP In Conversation. We hope that you will stay connected with us, sign up for our newsletter, follow our social media. We are on X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. We'll be sending a feedback survey, and we hope that you'll take a moment to fill that out, give us feedback on any way that we can improve future BRHP In Conversations. Again, thank you so much to Dr. Kathryn Anne Edwards. Really appreciate this conversation today, and I wish you all a great rest of your afternoon. Take care.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.